should go.
Let me ask them real quick. Can you hear me back there? So there's a student here asking, I guess they've reserved a room next to you guys, and they're going to be rehearsing singing, and they're wondering if that's going to be disruptive to this event. He's coming over here.
I did.
So we're hot. My phone. You have your phone?
Get my phone, yeah.
Do you want to scoot over this way so you can scoot into your setup easier?
I hate to read from a script, but
hello everyone, welcome again to our Friday seminar. Today we are going to have a seminar on the topic STS, Indigenous Knowledges and Practices. And the session will be moderated by our colleague Fernanda Rosa. She's online. Over to you, Fernanda.
Hello everyone, nice to see you all. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Awesome. It's a great honor for me to moderate this panel. It's a panel that was imagined as a way for our department to be more connected with the celebrations of Indigenous Day in the second Monday of October. And here we are. It's very hard to put together some stellar colleagues as the ones we have today, the pleasure to be with at the library. So that's why we are doing this still in October, but more towards the end of the month. I've been looking at the agenda of our seminar in the past semesters, and I am so glad to see that every semester since 2024, we have been discussing indigenous knowledges somehow. So if we think this fall, we already had Dr. Polanco among us talking about maize, which we can translate as corn. We also had in the past semester during the spring, Dr. Summer Alatot talking about settler colonialism, and some of us will also remember. Also, in 2024, we had a discussion on technology appropriation and the ways that indigenous peoples are bringing their knowledges to the discussion of technologies. We had a workshop to discuss technology appropriation with Yunuen Torres, who is a Puripecha woman from Cheran. Some of you will remember too. So all that to say that we have been very lucky to be in touch with discussions of indigenous knowledge somehow. I think the provocation I would like to do before starting this amazing panel is for us to think about how does this contact with this content and this other, I would say, ways of being and ways of knowledge can also help us think about our own researchers as STSers. I think one of the challenges we have when we bring this idea of indigenous knowledges in STS is for us to think as STSers how these knowledges can affect what we do. Instead of being considered an area that is a part of what we do, something that not necessarily correspond to what we study, how can we be open to see how these other knowledges, other epistemologies, other ontologies can also make us rethink what we are doing? So this is the provocation I would like to leave in the room. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our three speakers for today. Thank you so much for your availability. I know how hard it is for us to do that, so thank you very much. I will introduce the three of them together. So I will start with Dr. Edward Polanco, who we already know. He was born in Los Angeles, California, and he's a person from Cuscatlan. He's a scholar of Mesoamerica, and his interests include Nahuatl history and society, healing, and maize. He's an associate professor of history in Abiyala, the director of the Indigenous Studies program at Virginia Tech, and the author of Healing Like Our Ancestors, published by the University of Arizona Press. I would like to introduce as well Dr. Cana Uluak Itchuaqiyaq, who is a Iñupiaq scholar and a tribal citizen of the Noorvik Native Community in Northwest Alaska. And please correct my accent and my pronunciation as you can. She's an assistant professor of technical and scientific communication and the founding director of the Center for Sustainable Engagement in the Arctic here at Virginia Tech. Her work focuses on Arctic research, data governance, and research methodologies that support community-led initiatives and scientific innovation. Last but not least, or least and not last, we have Dr. Desiree Poets, an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science and a core faculty of the Aspect PhD program. Through ethnographically informed, critical, and collaborative methods, Dr. Poets has been working with urban indigenous, favela, and maroon communities and movements in Brazil's southeast region since 2013. Her research focuses on settler colonial, post-colonial, independence theories in Latin America, urban demilitarization, arts, collective memory, and community change. And it questions gender, ethnicity, class, and race. She's the author of Unsettling Brazil, by the University of Alabama Press. Please help me welcome these three speakers, and we can decide the order in the room. What do you think?
It looks like I'm going first.
Yep.
So I don't know how to put the slides
I think
on.
they'll put it on this.
Okay,
Yeah.
fabs. Thank you. So good afternoon, and teku for the invitation to present about my work today. Uvanga atiga ulok, anamarunga sikik nasriprum, takinani kikik tagrami, epani civilepta inyunegvetni, mamaga iiakpak norving me, papagashi lumen civukakmin. My name is Dr. Cana Uluak Itchuaqiyaq, and I'm Iñupiaq, and I was born on my homelands in northwest Alaska in the native village of Concieved. You can kind of see a weird arrow pointing at it. And in case you're wondering, Concieved was impacted by some of the storms and flooding that just hit western Alaska. My family and our homes are intact. Thank you to everyone who reached out to me. But our village suffered some serious damage from freezing floodwaters and their aftermath. Climate change isn't fair. And it's just one thing affecting the people of the Arctic right now. So here at Virginia Tech, I am the founder of the Center for Sustainable Engagement in the Arctic, or CSEA. CSEA is a new college-level center in Claus, focusing on supporting community-driven and community-serving Arctic research. Our work, beyond facilitating research and service activities that benefit both science and community partners in the Arctic, helps build the administrative, procedural, and ethical frameworks that allow Arctic communities, many of them indigenous, to define their own research priorities and to lead collaborations with universities and federal agencies. In practice, this means helping communities and institutions navigate things like data governance, research policy, workforce development, and the everyday logistics of equitable collaboration. So I come to this work as a technical communicator who is trained in what's often called the social justice turn in my field. And that orientation has taught me to pay attention to systems, to the forms, workflows, and approval processes that silently shape whose knowledge counts and whose doesn't, and how that works. Technical communicators understand that institutions communicate through paperwork, policies, templates, compliance forms, and contracts, all those very exciting things. So rather than seeing these structures only as barriers, however, I look for ways to harness existing bureaucratic systems to enact equity and reduce oppressive outcomes. In the context of Arctic research, that means asking how we can use institutional tools like IRBs, MOUs, and subaward contracts to protect indigenous knowledges and uphold community sovereignty, rather than allowing those same tools to reproduce extractive relationships. That's the grounding for my talk today, how we can use the very structures that often constrain us, the legal, procedural, and bureaucratic mechanisms of universities, to build protections into the system itself. So let's talk about everybody's favorite subjects, memoranda of understanding, MOUs, and subaward contracts. So, hey, woo, party time here. It's Friday night. At CC, we use MOUs to create policy scaffolding necessary for ethical and how do you say it? Reciprocal? How do you say it? Reciprocal. Thank you. Reciprocal research relationships. These agreements are developed before any funding begins so that when a subaward contract resulting from funding is eventually issued, the foundational expectations are already in place. It's important to note that most faculty don't actually have signing power for things like MOUs. These must go through the university's Office of Sponsored Programs and ultimately be signed by someone with institutional authority. In my work with a cultural, language, and educational organization for the Iñupiaq of Northwest Alaska, I drafted the MOU that we worked with, and then worked both with my community partner organization very closely, and then the Office of Sponsored Programs here at Virginia Tech to refine it. The final signers were the community partner organization and the Vice President for Research and Innovation here at Virginia Tech. And that administrative structure matters. When we later received funding and entered the subaward negotiation stage, we were able to use that same MOU as a supporting and guiding document. And the same institutional official who had signed the MOU also signed the subaward contract, harnessing institutional memory. Because the MOU had already addressed issues like intellectual property, data ownership, and decision-making power, those protections carried forward into the legally binding stage of our community partnership. So while faculty cannot legally sign MOUs here at Virginia Tech, we can strategically draft and shape them. The MOU is the moment when we have the power and the most flexibility to represent community priorities and rights within university systems before the process shifts fully into the institutional domain where we act only as agents of the university. So once a project receives funding, the partnership enters a new stage, the subaward contract. Now, while MOUs are typically considered handshake agreements, subaward contracts are legally binding and come into play whenever there is money involved, such as when a university like Virginia Tech here receives a federal grant and needs to distribute funds to other academic institutions or community partner organizations. So in simple terms, these contracts formalize the financial and legal relationships between institutions. And because they are binding, subaward contracts are governed by federal and institutional policy and include a series of standard clauses. And these clauses also matter. One of the most consequential, in my opinion, related to indigenous knowledges is the intellectual property clause. In this context, intellectual property refers to any products of research that can be owned or controlled. So data, manuscripts, software, recordings, designs, or even shared ideas or methods once they're documented. And this default position in most university contracts is that the university owns any intellectual property produced under its funding, either jointly or solely. This default creates real risks for community partners, especially when indigenous knowledges are part of the work, because those knowledges can become absorbed into institutional property frameworks without community consent or control. A key point related to intellectual property is the definition of indigenous knowledges itself. So too often, community definitions describe indigenous knowledges as something static, something that is established in the past, as if indigenous communities no longer generate new knowledges or experiences, which is laughable, to say the least. So for our purposes, in my projects, it was essential to define indigenous knowledges as living, emerging, and iterative, as dynamic intellectual property that continues to grow and adapt. Establishing that understanding early with the institution ensured that the living nature of these knowledges was acknowledged and protected as the project moved forward through formal funding stages. Subaward contracts are where definitions like these become formalized. Terms like indigenous knowledges, data, data sets, secondary data use, and research products gain specific contractual meaning. So if those definitions are left vague, they can erase community authority. But if an MOU already defines them in that previous work that you've done, that document gives the contracts team clear language to adopt, making legal negotiations easier and ensuring that community rights and data governance are protected in the binding contract itself. And it's worth noting that the way we submit grants influences whether this protection is even possible. So if your mind is wandering, I want you to pay attention to this, okay? Many researchers assume that the easiest route for collaborative research proposals, so collaborative research with other institutions, including community institutions, they want to go towards a simultaneous submission. and where each partner institution submits its own its own part of the proposal and a budget directly to the funder, instead of one lead institution managing the funds and issuing subawards. And it does seem simpler. Less paperwork, fewer tracking requirements, all those things, but there is a major trade-off. When each partner receives funds directly, you bypass the subaward process almost entirely. Without a subaward, there is no contractual space for the community to negotiate ownership or control of intellectual property or data. Each institution's default policies apply automatically, which can result in the community partners' knowledge and data being subsumed into institutional control across multiple universities. The convenience of simultaneous submission can come at the cost of sovereignty. The subaward process takes more effort, certainly, but it's where the real protections live, where definitions are formalized, authority is documented, and indigenous knowledges remain recognized and protected as the intellectual property of the communities to whom they belong.
Yeah, someone sent another link.
Okay, so now we're going to move towards expanding human subject research definitions. So this is another big part of research. So another place where these types of protections that you might be able to do for community partners can take shape is within university ethics and compliance systems, specifically the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. So at most universities, IRBs are designed to protect individual participants in research that collects identifiable private information or biological samples. But for many indigenous and Arctic communities, research rarely affects only individuals. Knowledge, data, or materials shared in research often represent collective intellectual property, something held and governed by the community itself. When these materials are taken, interpreted, or reused without proper oversight, the resulting harm can extend far beyond individual privacy, affecting community identity, reputation, and even economic stability. A well-known example of this is the Barrow alcohol study conducted in the late 1970s, which in now what's called Iñupiaq, Alaska. Back then, researchers surveyed residents about alcohol use and released their findings via publications before consulting the community about what those results actually were. And these findings were uptaken and reported on in national publications such as the New York Times. And so one New York Times article portrayed the Iñupiaq, my people, as an alcoholic society facing extinction. Yeah, not good. The fallout was devastating, to say the least. National media coverage stigmatized our community, damaging its reputation and morale. That reputational harm had tangible economic effects. So banks reportedly stopped lending to the community, or even just the borough itself, so like the governance structure of the community, creating severe financial hardship for residents and local businesses. The study technically complied with the federal ethics requirements of its time, yet it caused deep, enduring harm. So that case is now a staple in research ethics training. If you've taken the training here at Virginia Tech, you've heard about it, because it shows how research can create secondary unintended harm. In response to this type of risk, one of our Arctic regional health partners at CSEA worked with us to expand their own definition of human subjects research in their research policies, to include not only community narratives, language materials, and cultural information, but also the collection of physical and biological samples, so samples from people, animals, plants, lands, or the environment, whenever those materials were identifiable to the community or tied to local lands. So that policy change did two critical things. First, it reclassified much of what the universities might consider like regular research, it reclassified it as human subjects research, bringing it under IRB oversight. Second, it shifted the burden of enforcement of compliance to the community's research policy from the community to the university itself, which balances the scale a bit because, let's face it, communities and community organizations have way less institutional power and capacity than a billion-dollar corporation like Virginia Tech. So once a project falls under the IRB jurisdiction, compliance becomes the university's responsibility, or at least part of their responsibility, and IRBs take that role very seriously. So in conclusion today, what all these examples show, the MOU, the subaward contract, and the expanded IRB oversight, is that protecting indigenous knowledges and communities shouldn't just be focused on creating new systems. We can use the systems we already have today with greater care and intention and strategy. Yes, it's more work up front. Yes. Drafting MOUs take time. Woo! Negotiating subaward language requires persistence. Expanding IRB oversight means extra paperwork, like so much extra paperwork, training, and review. But that early effort is the difference between a respectful, lasting partnership and one that leaves harm in its wake. Yes, this creates more administrative work for researchers and universities, but that additional work protects communities and their rights from us. It uses the university's own compliance infrastructure to uphold community sovereignty. When we do that work at the beginning, we build the scaffolding for trust. We show that the university can be a responsible partner. Because once harm occurs, once a community's knowledge is misused or the reputation is damaged, the process of remediation is far more tedious, uphill, and often incomplete. No apology or correction could fully restore what was lost. So this is my call to all of us who work in research administration, in faculty roles, and in community partnerships. Do the hard work early. Protect the community and its knowledge from the beginning. Write the agreements, define the terms, and document the expectations while the relationship is strong and trust is growing. Doing it right at the start is not just compliance, it is respect. It's that good work towards ensuring that when communities choose to share their knowledge with you, they do so safely on their own terms and in a way that strengthens both science and sovereignty. Deku. Thank you.
There we go. Am I live on this thing? Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you for that. That was awesome. And I think there's a lot of good points there, particularly about having a very respectful approach, which I think has been really lacking in the academy historically. So today I'm going to be talking to you about Tisiyot, and I should say Tisiyot wan Tlapoalistli. Tlapoalistli is, actually I'll explain these terms to you in a second. So let's just jump in to some more of the fun stuff. So you have three phrases here. There's two reasons why they're here. So the top one says Naja ni mumachtiani, then it's Na ni mumachtihket, Newat ni mumachtiani. So these are all different variants of Nahuatl languages. The top one is from El Salvador. It is the remaining kind of active variant of Nahuatl. There are three dormant variants. And the bottom two are the middle one is one that is spoken contemporarily. It's from La Huasteca Veracruzana, and the bottom one is from the 16th century in central Mexico. So basically what we would say that the Aztec peoples, which were the Mexica from Mexico, Tenochtitlan. And the reason I have this up is so we can see the diversity in the variants of these languages and peoples, even though kind of fall under this umbrella, right? And the second reason is so that you learn a little something. So I'll have you repeat the first one with me, actually. Naja ni mumachtiani. So go ahead. Naja ni mumachtiani, which means I am a student. So it breaks down, machtiani or machtia means to learn or to teach, something of the sort. And this is essentially, I don't have time to get into the nuances of it, but the construction is reflexive. So it's basically I learn myself, which means I am a student, I am a learner, habitually a learner. And this is something that ties into this larger structure of how indigenous communities, but Nahuas in particular, are learning and disseminating knowledge to individuals, right? This idea that if you think you know everything, you're not necessarily going to learn anything else, right? So you're constantly learning, you're always evolving and trying to make yourself better. Here I'm showing you Mesoamerica. I can't recall if I showed you this map last time or not, but this is essentially showing you a cultural zone in what is today a large part of Mexico, from the central part of Mexico down into what is called El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua. It comprises a large part of Central America, a large part of Mexico, but it really gets us to think about this area outside of settler borders and thinking about the movement of knowledge and ideas throughout this space. Also the diversity of peoples and languages. So there are a ton of different languages throughout this area, and no one language really represents any other. So some of the things to kind of keep in mind here that I'm throwing out at you are Nahuas, broadly speaking. The term Nahua itself, without the S there, I suppose, just Nahua means intelligible sound, something that sounds good to my ears. And this is something that is recorded in Central Mexican Nahuas as they're describing other ethnic groups of indigenous people in the Central Mexican area, so people that the Mexica could understand, and people that they couldn't understand. And also a description of Spaniards that to many Nahuas, as it is recorded in the 16th century, thought that the Spanish language was very ugly and a very disturbing sound, which, fair enough, right? And the spellings here you see, some are phonetic and stuff like that, but Nahuas, essentially El Salvador and Mexico. So there are active languages existing today in what is Mexico and El Salvador. There are dormant languages in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. So those areas. And Nahuatl is the language. So the ancestral language of Nahuas in Mexico, and Nahuatl with a hard T is the ancestral language of Nahuas in El Salvador. And some of the other things here that we'll kind of dissect a little bit is the term, which is gender neutral, but this is something that in my work on 16th century Nahua knowledge, this term no longer exists in most communities. There's some exceptions, but it's changed in how it's used. But this term essentially is gender neutral, so it could be used for a woman or for a man. And it basically means a healing specialist, a ceremonial specialist. And tisiot, we'll talk about the breakdown of that word in a second. Basically, that is healing knowledge. So the Spaniards, when they're interpreting both of these concepts, are gendering tisit. When we're talking about male tisit, or titisi, the plural, you're going to see Spaniards really contorting these ideas into medicos, or physicians. And when we're talking about female titisi, you see the sources start to go into what the partera territory, which would be a midwife. Tisiot gets called medicine, medicina, ciencia, something like that, which essentially is medicine or science, right? And to some degree, I'm kind of, and it'll be interesting to have a conversation with you all and you all, with everyone. I'm troubled by the term science or medicine when it's being applied to indigenous knowledge. Not because I don't think that it merits that type of label or prestige or what have you, but I think it takes us into a territory where we're comparing indigenous knowledge to what science is and what to expect out of that. Then you have some other terms out here, kokoshki, a sick person, kokolistli, illness, baktinamilistli, health. Pahtli is a salubrious item used therapeutically. There are some variants of Nahuatl where pahtli could also be poison, a toxin, which logically makes sense, right? So Tylenol could be salubrious, but it could also put you to sleep for a while, right? Or forever if you take too much. Tlapoalistli is basically the human interpretation of items, and we're going to talk about this in a little more detail in a second. And this is used as a vessel of communication, and this is a practice that is still used to this day in Nahua communities, not all, but many. And this is essentially a specialist, oftentimes a tlapuhki or a tisit, acting as a tlapuhki, a counter of things, interpreter of things, interacting with items such as maize kernels, beans, cords, to receive information that is unknown to human beings from non-human forces and then relate that to human beings so that human beings can ascertain why someone is sick, why someone is missing, where they are, stuff like that. And this notion of tisiot and tlapoalistli writ large come, at least from a perception of the Mexica people whose kind of histories are recorded the best out of the most Nahua groups, from these two individuals, Oxomoxco and Zipactonal. Zipactonal is the male, so here in this particular image he's on the right, and on the left-hand side is Oxomoxco, which is basically the female counterpart. These are the primordial humans, or this kind of shift, depending how you want to understand it, between non-human forces into human peoples. And they bring this knowledge. And so here you see on the left-hand side this woman who is casting corn, and she is the individual. She's the first woman to practice this, and then she shares this with human women. This is, let me back up real quick actually. So this is the codex, what's called the Codex Bourbonicus. Many of these codices, or what are called codices, are given names of the European places that house them, or Europeans that own them, so to speak, and sometimes can become abstracted from the individuals who created them. So this was created by Nahua peoples in the 16th century. There is some Spanish gloss there, so Spanish priests might have been involved in encouraging the creation of this, or may have added glosses later. This item here is from the 16th century as well. This is the Historia General de las Cosas de la Nueva España. And this was created, I believe I did mention this last time I was in here, this was created by a Franciscan settler priest, and with the help of various trilingual Nahuas. And what I'm focusing on in this particular image, and we're going to see a couple others from this source, is an expression of this knowledge of Tlapoalistli and Tisiot, which are intrinsically connected, though Tisiot is kind of related, not necessarily the same thing, right? But they're connected. And here we see the man casting corn on a reed mat, and the woman is actually interpreting knots, which is something that isn't discussed a whole lot. The maize kernels are a little bit more, the knots not so much. But the Spaniards are constantly trying to figure out how this works, and they're casting it from their perception. This is something that doesn't end up being called science. It doesn't end up being called knowledge. It ends up being called divination, something that's either guesswork or something that's powered by the devil. And sometimes you're going to see priests who are talking about this, who will say this stuff works. People can actually find missing people. People can find out why someone is sick. People can find out the right medicine to use or the right bachtli. But it's not because it works, it's because the devil is confusing these people to go away from God, and they follow these practitioners away from real medicine. And so here you see, this is a cover of my book. This is kind of showing that relationship. So what's happening here with the cover, or the particular part of the two women that I find interesting, is I talked to an elder in the community that my grandfather's from. It's called Panchimalco in El Salvador. It's now a suburb of San Salvador. And he is a fantastic artist, so I actually showed him these two images, which are showing here again at Tlapoalistli. There's a woman on the right-hand corner there casting corn or maize and beans to interpret some type of information, possibly about health, possibly about the man to the right. And on the left, you see this first fire ceremony where this child is being bathed and named and obtaining their fire source inside of their body. So I showed him that, and I said, I want to create something kind of new, something mixing these things and information. And what I really like about the cover, the image, from my perspective at the very least, is that it has these Nahua ideas and things, but it also, the women kind of look a little bit more what you would perceive as Maya in a lot of archaeological evidence or things of the like. And that's because of the connection in El Salvador to Maya peoples and the closeness that we have there, right? Let me go back. So these items of information are all cast and understood by the Western mind in various ways, right? And one thing to note is the trilingual men who are fluent in writing and speaking Latin, Spanish, and Nahuatl are not learning Tisiot or other forms of Nahua knowledge in this College of the Holy Cross in Tlatelolco, right? It's a shift to understanding and learning Western things, how to be a Western person, which is not too different from the universities we have today, right? So the universities today that we have are, by and large, a design of the Western mind, and they're geared to create a Western mind. So how do we function within these things? So we have this word tisit. You take off the absolutive stem, you add yot, which is an abstractor, which basically makes this like the things of the tisit. So this literally translates as the things of the tisit, or las cosas del tisit, something like that, la tisit. And this gives us this idea here of knowledge of a whole slew of systems that these individuals were trained in. But one thing I want to note here too is that the training that occurs particularly for the tisit, some scholarship had talked about that individuals would go to something called a calmecac in the very kind of Mexica Nahua context. I haven't found any evidence of that, but this is something that was transferred through generations. Women were at the core of this, so we've been seeing a lot of images here where women are involved in a variety of spaces. That's not by accident. Women, some scholarship originally had really been arguing that women only took the forefront after these massive epidemics that must have killed all of these male practitioners. Incorrect. You see information all over the place and evidence, archaeological. Some of these etchings also exist archaeologically, and you see images in all kinds of places and textually that show women not only very active, but actually creating, such as Oshamoko, right, creating this knowledge and spreading it out. Tlapoalistli, as I've kind of been explaining, is literally the counting interpretation of things. Meka Tlapoalistli is what this woman is doing here, who she is counting chords. And then Tlaol Chayawalistli is basically the casting of corn or maize. Hurling is kind of what it is, like you're just throwing it in understanding what's happening. There are some accounts from Spaniards kind of harassing and interrogating and beating people to figure out what's going on. But what these things mean, but not really in depth. Let me back up real quick and I'll say that many of these things, particularly casting maize, is something that a lot of people are still doing to this day. Well, not a lot, but some people are still doing to ascertain information. It's a very specialized skill. This is something that's created, often when we talk about the brutality of the colonial process, which hasn't ended, right? I like to point to my students and to whoever will listen to me, and this point is going to be you guys, that the Spaniards have their own receipts, right? They created, and the English, the French, they created places where they acknowledged the violence that they were exacting on indigenous people. So in this particular context here, this is from the 16th century. This is created by some Nahuas from Tlaxcala who were collaborators with the Spaniards, and they're depicting the destruction of items, a mochtli, which would be something like a book or a medium of knowledge, various regalia for dancers, also for ceremonial specialists that are being destroyed by Franciscans with the help of some indigenous people there in the back that seem to be Hispanized to some degree or in touch with Spanish power. One of the other things, and this will be the last thing I'll kind of talk about here, that I see and have been trying to combat, and I think this is something that weaves into also the Black experience in the colonial system that has unfolded in the Western Hemisphere, and that's the erasure of practitioners along with the knowledge, right? So you have these discussions of items, so sihuapachtli, something that is still used today, so apatle, sihuapatle in Mexico by indigenous and non-indigenous people. Oftentimes gets discussed in many sources from the 16th, 17th century and then subsequently scholarship. So this is something that scholarship is kind of engaging in, is perpetuating that violence of colonialism, explaining things like the Franciscans did or the Dominicans did, which is usually lost and perverse. But here you'll see conversations about things. This is just an example of Siwapahtli, but you don't see who is doing it, who is harvesting, who is preparing, because a lot of these things are everywhere, right? So you'll see descriptions of tomatoes, Siwapahtli, it grows among the houses, it grows everywhere, but how does it become Pahtli? Siwapahtli literally means medicine for women. So this is used for women who are having difficult labors, things of the like. The Spaniards are very disturbed by this because they believe it can be used to cause abortions. But by cross-referencing, you can really see that there are women in particular, but Titisi involved heavily in the creation of this knowledge and dissemination of this knowledge, the keeping of this knowledge. The Spaniards are heavily going to target this term tisit in the 16th and 17th century, and that's why it kind of falls out of use. They're constantly coming into villages or communities and saying, where's the tisit here? Because we know you guys have one. But in this particular context here from the Historia General, you see this example of this woman who has brewed Siwapahtli, and she's giving it to this woman who, if you really focus on the lower abdomen in particular, but the abdomen, you kind of start to see that she's got a little bump there. So she is giving her this brew, this pahtli, so that she can give birth more easily. She's been struggling according to some of the text on this. So yeah, I think part of what I'll finish off here is just starting to really deeply think about what is knowledge, what is science, and should we be applying that to indigenous knowledges, and what happens when we apply or compare indigenous healing practices, in this case tisiyot, to medicine. What deficiencies does that create? How does that make us think about things in a Western dynamic to begin with? And yeah, I'll end there. Let me load yours up.
Thank you.
And that's it, right?
Thanks. Okay. Thank you, everyone. That was great. We'll have more time in the Q&A to talk. I'm presenting a quite theoretical paper today. That's a working paper. It's a draft, so bear with me. And it was first drafted in the early months of 2023 with a few colleagues from Brazil, Francine Rossoni, but also the Guarani Kaiowá anthropologist Emerson Souza Guarani, and the Quilombola Maroon, also anthropologist and historian, Miriam Arprijo. And we wanted to reflect on how sovereignty is conceptualized in our field, international relations, Francine's in my field, but also how it is conceptualized in a bill that was being passed at the time in the Supreme Court that I'll talk about more in a minute. And what I hope we can maybe do today is have a conversation about what sovereignty means in your fields, in your work, and how it doesn't travel maybe. And so, like I was saying, at the time, we were responding to the so-called landmark thesis that was contained in a proposed bill, Bill 490 of 2007. And this bill suggested that only indigenous and Maroon territories that were already occupied by indigenous and Maroon peoples at the time that Brazil's 1988 constitution was enacted could be claimed and formally recognized by the state. Maroons, by the way, in Brazil called quilombos, were historically relatively autonomous communities of enslaved black people that since the 1988 constitution have collective land rights, and they're often seen as legally quite similar to indigenous communities. The bill since then has been voted unconstitutional, but its tenets very much kind of persist. And our initial aim in this paper was to offer an intellectual intervention that centered indigenous and Quilombola scholarship, so published research on sovereignty that disputes the colonial logic both of the bill and of how international relations has conceptualized sovereignty. Because both of those conceptions obfuscate not only Maroon and indigenous conceptions of sovereignty, but also, we argue in the paper, the differential sovereignty or the sub-sovereignty that is also granted to so-called developing states like Brazil, right? And then October 7 or Al-Aqsa flood happened, and we found ourselves in kind of a moment of aporia. Palestine really forced a reckoning with the national question, with the question of third world sovereignty across our discipline, on our campus, and in world politics. And it once again revealed what many critical scholars, including those who are in third world and Marxist international law and whose work we built to conceptualize sovereignty in IR in the paper, have long argued that the doctrine of sovereignty was created by and for European colonialism and imperialism, and that behind it lies always the naked force of empire. And at that juncture, we found that our discipline, and perhaps you share this in your disciplines too, was not only complicit with, but actually intellectually supportive of the disavowal and the criminalization of Palestinian resistance. And what enraged us the most at the time was that this was happening at the same time that the coloniality, modernity, decoloniality group had been taken up by like everyone, and everyone was decolonizing this and pluralizing that. And it had really come to the center of our field, to the point that the then president of the International Studies Association, a big IR scholar, a feminist big scholar, you know, gives a presidential address that co-opts all of the languages, all of the terms of the decolonial turn. She talked about indigenous ontologies, relationality, reciprocity, land as pedagogy, like you name it, as she was blocking any motions that we were trying to pass in the governing council to not only make a statement on Gaza, but also bring boycott, divestment, and sanctions, BDS, into governing conversations at the ISA. We stood in front of her with signs and protests, and I remember just like hearing the dying echo of decoloniality in the background, thinking, all right, that was it, you know, it did a thing. Now we have to figure something new, right, out. And many of you might already have had critiques of the coloniality, decoloniality, modernity group in your fields, or we can go back to it in the Q&A. In the interest of time, I'll just leave it at that. But what happened to us with this paper was that we were a little bit unsure about what kind of an unsettling or revelatory critique of sovereignty would then do. Ali Khan, who is a third world international law scholar, wrote recently a paper in which he talks about how many of us faced with, as he writes, the imperial violence without the cover of ostensibly universal ideals that has been committed in Gaza since 2023, many of us began to question, as he writes, whether there remains any critical purchase in practicing critique in its revelatory mode. Like, what is there left to reveal when it comes to the exercise of such naked violence? And then recently Venezuela happened to, so we thought it might be time to actually continue this work, because US hegemony is waning. That is something that people have been saying since the 1970s, but it has recently launched a new attack on Latin American sovereignty in Venezuela, and actually things were escalating a lot last night with attacks on vessels under the guise of the so-called war on drugs, which is insane. No one has ever reported that Venezuela produces or circulates or distributes drugs. It is a regime change operation, a false flag operation. It's an imperialist intervention into national sovereignty. And so we were then thinking, oh, maybe we should write about this, because Brazil has, in response, as it has done historically, continued its quite ambiguous role in world politics, at times saying a lot about multipolarity, but actually aligning with Western interests, including in the military occupation of Haiti under the MINUSTAH mission in the early 2000s. And Lula is actually part of the problem. So we think about this kind of inconsequential counter-hegemony of Lulismo and the Workers' Party today in the paper too. And we also locate this kind of ambiguous role that Brazil plays globally as one of the consequences of its domestic settler colonial structures that work to reproduce neocolonial relations, right? So the question of national sovereignty and liberation remains unsettled also in Brazil, and this question matters not only for the coming or emerging multipolar world, but also because it is inseparable from Black and Indigenous sovereignty at home, quote unquote. Okay, I have a long introduction just so you've heard the argument in case I need to cut it short. But what I'll do today is just sketch the flow of the argument, and I'd love to hear from you all how these terms circulate in your fields and what we share and what we maybe don't share. So if you are a student of international relations, you'll have learned a few basic things about sovereignty. First, you learn from the beginning that sovereignty was established in Europe in the 1648 Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War. You learn that it comprises a state's exclusive authority within a delimited territory, the so-called spatial or territorial fix. You learn that this authority includes the monopoly of violence, and you learn that sovereignty is therefore part of the time of modernity, in the sense that it is a temporal developmental schema in which you move from pre-modern, pre-European, tribal, feudal, religious, traditional, to modern, rational, secular, European forms of sovereignty. So sovereignty in this account starts in Europe, then spreads to the rest of the world, especially with decolonization in Africa and Asia after the Second World War. There's so much scholarship that shows how this account is not universal, but historical and racialized. In the paper, like I said, we kind of focus specifically on Third World and Marxist international law. And we build on the work, for example, of Siba Grovogi, who is now the president of the International Studies Association, so we'll see how that goes. Anthony Engi, China Mieville, and also on the work of indigenous scholars like the Nunga scholar Irene Watson, who revealed that sovereignty is actually a colonial and imperial grammar of order. So it's fascinating to read this work because you see in the accounts of international law or European jurists and how they twist and turn to kind of at every stage make sure that they are both determining what sovereignty is in a way that denies it to non-European peoples, right? So Engi's work, for example, shows that the sovereignty doctrine emerges not in Westphalia, but in the colonial encounter between the Spanish and the indigenous peoples of the Americas, with the work especially of the Spanish jurist Francisco de Vitoria, who asks, who is sovereign? And that's kind of the beginning of international law and the sovereignty doctrine, according to Engi. And since then, racial and civilizational hierarchies have remained embedded at the heart of the sovereignty doctrine. So when it shifts, for example, so Vitoria starts what's called international law under natural law, then it shifts to positivist law in the 19th century, and once again Europeans will like twist and turn to come up with a new standard of civilization that is then denied, right? They formulate it in a way that denies it to non-European peoples. And at this juncture, Watson also shows how this is a profound ontological violence, right? It is the erasure of indigenous law and being through, for example, the positivist claim that only the European state produces legality and possesses sovereignty. And they show that this construct is from the beginning undergirded by violence because behind the unequal treaties that are signed between indigenous nations in the Americas, but also between European states and Asian and emerging African states, right? These unequal treaties are always backed by violence, gunboat diplomacy, colonial conquest, just wars, and so on, right? So sovereignty in this work appears actually as a juridical translation of imperial violence, in which some violence is legitimate and other violence is criminalized, and resistance is then always criminalized and illegitimate. So we say in the paper, you know, if sovereignty belongs to the time of modernity, it also belongs to the time of coloniality. And building on this, then we also unpack how the temporal landmark thesis actually reproduces the same spatial and temporal fixes that we find in IR's doctrine of sovereignty. And we draw, for instance, on the work of Mark Rifkin to argue that the circumscription of indigenous land claims to a delimited territory and moment in settler national history, 1988, erases indigenous and maroon temporal and territorial orientations, which are part of self-determination. And that reproduces the old trope of the so-called, you know, vanishing Indian. We also turn to the work, the published work of Guarani and Biá scholar Martins Machado, to center, for example, how the Guarani search for the land without evil, which comprises a caminhada, a continuous collective walk, comprises also an expanded notion of territory, the Guará, Guarani, that understands territory as horizon, right? And as they walk, the Guarani sometimes settle for a while in new territories. They always walk along the Atlantic forest and will also cross national borders to the south of Brazil. And when they settle in those territories for a while, they call on the state to demarcate those lands so that they can stay there for however long they need to stay there. And this is an ontological and a material encounter with the state, right? It's an encounter of different temporalities, of different territorialities, of different sovereignties that are then in negotiation. And this challenges the settler state. And one state agent once said to me when we were with the Guarani in Guarani Iñupiaq community in the Jaraguá, which is in the middle of the city of São Paulo, he said, the Guarani can't keep going and walking here and there and then demanding that we just follow them around, demarcating territories, right? And the landmark thesis was actually an attempt to settle this for once and for all, right? But this dispute between the state and indigenous peoples and maroon peoples in Brazil is rendered entirely invisible to international relations. It is not considered relevant to the study of global politics, right? Because its state centrism not only leaves settler sovereignty unproblematized, it also conceptually upholds the temporal and the spatial fixes it contains. So, returning to the 19th century then, the so-called standard of civilization formulated by positivist international law denied sovereignty not only to non-European peoples, but also to the emerging or already established non-European states, right? Japan will really struggle to fit into this standard of civilization, for example, unless they pass internal and external reforms that conform to European norms of government, diplomacy, and economy that enabled the continuation of the global project of accumulation that upholds European hegemony. So you can have sovereignty as long as you don't really have sovereignty, right? Like that's kind of the logic behind this. And it's fascinating to read how European jurists are like doing acrobatics with their logics to make this happen. Because, whatever. Like, you have a Chinese state long before you even have like any relevance of European agency in world history. So, but a state like Brazil, right, that was structured through settler colonialism, but was 62% Black and Indigenous shortly after independence in 1822, is then from the beginning very ambiguously positioned within this standard of civilization. And anxious to show that it met these standards, its settler elites adopted European norms and intensified settler colonial dispossession and elimination at home, including through a national eugenicist whitening policy that affected Black and Indigenous peoples in related but distinct ways. And we see this kind of whitening policies in many other settler colonies, including in Canada and in the US, right? So Brazil is not simply a victim of imperial violence, it's actually also a participant in reproducing its logic, and the landmark thesis is evidence for this, as we say in the paper. And so as I then, going back to my book, as I argue there, we then think about how Brazil's settler colonial structures have conditioned its semi-peripheral insertion into the world system, which has enabled the continuation of direct and indirect foreign infiltration on the economic, political, and cultural levels, because sovereignty in this semi-peripheral dependent position remains partial. The Bolsonaro-Trump alliance is one example of this, right? Recently, I don't know if people saw this in the news, Trump passed very heavy sanctions or tariffs on Brazil because Brazil is prosecuting Bolsonaro on multiple counts of a coup plot following his 2022 election loss to Lula, right? He was convicted anyway, he's going to jail, right? But Trump then passes tariffs as an attempt to intervene, right? And on Venezuela, I recommend always that my students watch The Revolution Will Not Be Televised on the attempted 2002 coup. That also is one of those examples of how settler imperialist powers collaborate to uphold this world order, right? At this point then in the paper, we also introduce a more Brazilian Black Marxist tradition that thinks about Marronage as Black and national liberation, such as in the work of Clóvis Moura that you see there at the bottom, and Abdias Nascimento. And in this work, rooted in the historical model of the Quilombo of Palmares, for example, Abdias Nascimento's Quilombismo envisions the transformation of Brazil into a just and egalitarian national Quilombo state founded on African values of solidarity, collective ownership, and social equality that is part of a wider Pan-African struggle. And by reclaiming Brazil's African roots and aligning national liberation with the global freedom of African peoples, Quilombismo then becomes both a reconstruction of the nation from below, an internal decolonization, and an act of external decolonization that includes effective national autonomy that breaks, for instance, with what he describes as the practice of handing over, quote unquote, our mineral reserves and our economy to international monopolistic corporations. Speaking maybe to the work of Fernanda, one example of this today is how Starlink, Elon Musk Starlink, is a key provider of internet in the Amazon region, a super important region for so many reasons, Why is he the one offering into that infrastructure there? It's part of these imperial infrastructures, right, that continue to undermine third world sovereignty, indigenous sovereignty, maroon sovereignty, even in the existence of formal equality in international law, right? And so in this at this point then, thinking with the Quilombola Negubishpu about the confluence of Black and Indigenous peoples, whom he describes as Afro-Pindoramic peoples whose worlds have much in common without becoming the same. This is how he thinks about it. We then understand that a liberated Brazil is one in which there is confluence between Indigenous and Black sovereignty toward national liberation from both settler, colonial, and imperial forces. But what was the fate of the Republic of Palmares, where we actually had tens of thousands of people living for 100 years, right? It was also a centuries-long armed struggle against European forces. And at the end of this struggle, Zumbi, who we see there in one of the pictures, is captured and beheaded, and he was the leader of Palmares. And so Palestine and Palmares remind us, and Venezuela, that sovereignty is a force-mediated relation, and this is still true in the contemporary era of universalized sovereignty, in which our field, international relations, remains myopically preoccupied with the question of how order emerges among equal states. Well, as the title of Mieville's book says, and here he is quoting chapter 10 in Capital Volume 1 by Marx, between equal rights, force decides. And still, sovereignty has also been rearticulated as a liberatory alternative by colonized peoples themselves, right? But this rearticulation has been hard won, not granted. And it is the grounded resistance of those who struggle for sovereignty because they have no other choice but to do so that have indeed taught us what sovereignty means. And in conclusion, then in the paper, we recall the temporality of resistance that overturns the temporal and spatial fixes of settler and imperial sovereignty, of resistance not as a linear forward march toward liberation, but a return to unfinished struggles, ancestral memories, and repressed ways of being. What Aymara scholar, you see her there in the top picture, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, calls Pachacuti, an eruption and continuity at once, a temporal and cosmic reordering that undoes colonial and imperial arrangements of space, time, and power, a world turned upside down. Pachacutis from Palmares to Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you all for the presentations. Now we will take questions from those in the room and then questions from online as well.
I hate to be the one who always starts. Thank you all it was really great to see the connections between the three presentations. I do a lot of bureaucratic work, so I'm going to start us off with a bureaucracy question, but it's really fascinating to see how the concept of sovereignty bookended this conversation. We talked about the challenges of simultaneous submission. It was always my understanding and my experience that a lot of the rationale for simultaneous submission is about sovereignty, and it's about the individuals or collectives from different organizations trying to insist or assert their own, that they get both the credit and the overhead. And so I'm just curious, as you manage these negotiations, how you deal with those power differentials that are at play for all the stakeholders.
Yeah, thank you. So in thinking about simultaneous submission, yes, it could be a place where people or community organizations or universities, institutions that are all participating to be able to manage their own funds, right? But it also, when it comes to community engaged research, there's not a really great history of academic partners upholding their end of the bargain. I'm just going to say it out loud. It's actually a really crappy history that when you look at it closely, it just makes you understand why it is so hard to get community partners to want to work with you because of that history of extraction, and really it's actually a violent history in a lot of ways, when it's like people's knowledges become taken as part of university property, right? That is awful. And so when, yes, a lot of communities don't have the infrastructure to be like the primary lead organization in a grant, federal grant submission process, especially in the United States, where when you look at, let's say, National Science Foundation, and you look at letters of collaboration, for example, the template that they give you, it says, if the proposal submitted by doctor, place name here, right? It starts off with this idea that one must have a PhD, or I guess a medical something, right? To be able to be a PI. And even in submission, in RFPs, you'll see who can qualify as PIs, and sometimes it isn't communities, but they're making strides towards that. So, but even if the policies allow for communities to become PIs, reviewers often put a stop to that, because they wonder, do they have the capacity, right? Do they have the finance people, the compliance people, all these different things? And you'll see, that in either your R1, R2, or R3 of I'm, as part of a minus of your potential intellectual merits or the ability for you to do this work, that you will see that people, communities are often, if they are PIs, are ranked low in the ability or the perceived ability to be able to manage grants. And so in that space, yes, communities can enact their sovereignty or enact that power by a simultaneous submission, but the risk, especially in today's time where it's data, all these, we're having to put our data in these repositories, we're having to do all this open data, and then people are like, what about fair and care? And then they're trying to figure that out, right? There's a lot of things happening. In those spaces, communities often, when they are trying to negotiate after the fact with institutions like Virginia Tech, they do not have the same amount of power. We have a true legal team here, and so where a community partner has 3 full-time employees, right? How are they going to do that? And so as part of whoever is the lead organization, part of what they do in a single submission versus that simultaneous submission, what they do, so at CC, if we act as that, we are acting in proxy for the community. So we are harnessing Virginia Tech's power as an institution, right? And that the ethos for reviewers as an institution for the community itself, but we're also watching all our partners, right? And saying, are you fulfilling what you're supposed to be doing? Because if you don't, I'm sorry, that's not going to be we're not going to, you're not going to be getting the other parts of your funds. We are managing the funds on behalf of the community. So it takes a couple of things for it to really work. But if communities have that potential to be able to manage these grants, and they are awarded, which is a big and if they are awarded, then if they want to be the lead organization, that's great, but I don't know if the simultaneous, when it comes to the nuts and bolts of binding agreements, I think you actually lose more than you win, in my opinion.
Thank you so much. I loved all 3 of your talks. They were really amazing. And I'm just going to take a stab at that's really such a bad word, take a stab at something. Season. It's a perfect season for it. Stabbing pumpkins. But just to try to think of what you're saying in terms of STS, and I think, as a newcomer to the department, I'm learning that STS means a lot of things to different people here in STS. There's not one coherent that this is STS, and it's a very amorphous, constantly changing thing. But one of the things that I was thinking about as you were all talking was one concept, which is boundary work, both as a concept to think about what you're talking about, but also the kind of boundary work that STS does. So, STS is Science Technology Studies. So one of the things that has been a pet peeve of mine in STS is that we don't consider other forms of knowledge as an object of study or to engage with it as much. That's not entirely true, but like with bureaucratic knowledge, I don't really see many STS papers that work with, they work on citizen science or scientific knowledge, but this kind of technical expertise that you were talking about, to try to use our existing tools to shape more just outcomes for communities is it's been and other people can disagree with what I'm saying. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't think I am, but maybe I am. It gets bracketed out. So I think that's the kind of work that is very interesting, and especially in thinking about democracy, liberal democracy right now, and the kind of work that Russell Vogt is doing within sitting at the OMB and using bureaucratic tools to move money around. That's something that STS should be studying. And so, in thinking about boundary work as a concept of like what gets constituted as science and not, and I would say that a lot of STS scholars would say that what you're these historical figures and existing living figures are doing with, their traditional knowledges is still relevant knowledge. Like, why does it have to be this sort of Enlightenment era kind of understanding of what science is or what medicine is? So I think there's a lot of fruitful place for like thinking together with STS. And I'm sorry I'm going on, I'll stop. But with sovereignty, that is something that's always, I think sits in the background of what STS does, but I don't think people are, they would be more like, let's see how sovereignty is being defined by different people. Let's see how sovereignty is being understood in these different, so they take a more meta approach, I feel, as opposed to so where sovereignty comes up is thinking of in the liberal democratic framework sometimes within are they part of this Habermasian deliberative sphere of in a citizens panel on technology or something? Or, STS is so big, you have indigenous and STS or decolonial STS, all this stuff. And, sovereignty comes up there for sure, but it's different for different people.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Hey, that's what I mean.
Fernanda has a hand up. Fernanda.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for these talks. I'm thinking a lot about what you guys are defining as ontological encounter. I think all of you were talking about ontological encounters, and I see, for example, when Cana is trying to help us to make this encounter possible and respectful is an approach. Then we have another ontological encounter, which appears in Desiree's presentation, which seems like we cannot make this work. And we see on Edward's presentation the question about how do we do this work, right? Should we use the same terms or not? So I would like to bring this question back to you guys so you can develop more. We have an author that is Marisol de la Cadena, who talks about radical difference. It's such a difference that it doesn't dialogue. But I see some of you trying to make this dialogue possible or questioning this dialogue, the way we should do it, or saying, we need help here because it's not working. That's how I heard your talk. So I'd like to bring it back and see how you could develop that. Thanks.
Go ahead.
She was using your quote. So, if I understand what, thinking about that, the boundary spaces, or those moments of that, and ontological, encounters, right? And where we, I think a lot about humility in these spaces, and realizing that we might not know what we think we know, I learned the phrase epistemological humility, and it's so funny when I have to look up what's ontology, axiology, epistemologically, right? Right. And then I think about when I work with communities and they talk to me, they're like, just use it in English. And I'm like, you're right. Like what, I don't know what these mean. But one of the things that I think about and thinking about how does ontology work, especially in that boundary between what is science, what is medicine, what is indigenous knowledge, what is sovereignty, what is a liberatory alternative. Oh my gosh, that blew my mind. And so thinking through that, I have to have humility. And the reason what I mean about humility, and I talk a lot about cultural humility, but just basic humility, is I have to understand that in my own work, I cannot be striving for perfection in that my approach to work. So I need to, my approach to my work has to be one of a learner, right? What was the word that you used?
Nima Machtiani.
Yeah, Nima Machtiani, right? I need to think of myself as a learner forward, and so as a learner, I can make mistakes, and I can have these boundaries touch. I can have these ontologies interact, and I could not understand exactly what is happening for every person or individual organization or the actors involved in an occurrence, right? And so in that space, if I try to appease everybody and I try to do everything perfectly or correctly, then I get frozen. No action ever happens. And that's what I see in my own field, in not technical communication, but in Arctic science. For years and 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 years, right? My dad used to do this work back in the 90s. I was a child, high schooler, and I remember they were asking for the same thing, that as we are exactly asking today, when his grown up, almost 50-year-old kid is doing very similar work, which is how can we be at the indigenous people from the Arctic be at the table when it comes to research that impacts and deals with the Arctic? And it's the same exact question. And so we have this thing where we've had workshops on it for decades now, of how to bring indigenous knowledge into the science. Right? And then now I keep saying, let's just call it science. I'm sorry. And and we just call it science, and that way we can just stop that freaking thing, and we can actually get some work done and figure out how, as a data person, figure out how to make that interoperable. So we can we can work together in these in how do we analyze this kind of stuff. And so I feel sometimes we get rotten with perfection. And to use a anti-Semite's word, and and sorry, it's Kenneth Burke and you. And so, but I, to think about that, where we work so hard to get to this perfection thing that we just get stunted and we never start, because we're afraid to do it wrong. And that's how it happens when people are trying to work with indigenous communities, when they're trying to do this community engaged work, is that they're striving so hard to get it right that they never actually start the work itself, which the first work is that humility work, to say I'm allowed to make a mistake and I'm going to have relationships here. And so when I make a mistake, Eddie can say, I didn't like that, can we try something different? And I could hear him say that to me, and I could say, I'm not bad, I didn't do it correctly, and so can we try again? Yeah, let's do that. And that's all that's wanted. like, and so it's, I think, I don't know if that answered the question, but that's how I heard it.
Sure. Big question, I guess, right? And I appreciate your response. I think, it is a spicy take, my take, about calling it science or not. And there are definitely some great scholars that are using science, indigenous science or what have you. And I think sometimes it could be pedantic and you get hung up on what do we call it, and it's like, who cares, is this do work? So totally, appreciate that. And I think with that too, it's worth saying that the double-edged sword of critiquing calling it science or not is that historically, with internal colonialism in the sense of ordering the settler colony, a big part of that, whether we're talking about the settler nation of Mexico, the settler nation of Guatemala, the settler nation of the United States, is that the settlers conceptualized and perpetuated this idea that their knowledge was better, right? That whatever they called it was better than anything that was there. And that what the people were doing, the indigenous people were doing, was not adequate, real, had any merit. And, that's everywhere. And right, so if we say indigenous, Aztec, Nahua, Maya, medicine, whatever, there's like, cool, we're actually talking about this like with Spanish medicine or what have you. But then you could potentially lose this idea of like, what is it rooted in ancestrally, right? So I'm also sometimes critical of the term traditional because like, what does that mean exactly? I get where it's coming from, right, and all that, but sometimes I like to use ancestral more, right? Like ancestral knowledge or ancestral what have you, because ultimately it comes down to doing things like your ancestors did, right? Doing things like your parents did, like they learned from their grandparents, and things shift and modify along the way. But it's what you're learning, and that's how it's always kind of been, right? Until the white dudes came. And yeah, so that's kind of what I'm constantly myself conflicted by it, right? Because what are we losing by not calling it science, and what are we gaining, and what are we gaining and losing by calling it something else? But I think it also strikes as the plurality, right? If we're talking about like the ancestral knowledge of your people and what they called healing and what they called understanding the world and individual and communities with each other and the world, and how that differs from other peoples, we get to see that plurality, right? That gets lost oftentimes in a variety of ways, right? Even like the word, obviously it's not even on the table right now, but like, like Indian, and how that destroys so much plurality in whatever language that might be. So yeah, that's not really saying much, I guess, but saying something. So yeah, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I think what has been limiting about the kind of language of the radical difference, Marisanta Cadena's work, this kind of idea of it being primarily an ontological dispute, is that what's really the radical difference in that encounter is that it is a radical difference of power, capacity, capability. In your account, Cana, it's like a billion-dollar corporation, Virginia Tech, encountering a community with far fewer resources, but within the national context, you can have something like liability because you do have a state that can mediate that relationship through force, right? If someone breaks the law, there will be consequences, there will be punishment, there will even be, people will go to jail, right? Like there will be fines that are paid. At the international level, that is not possible. So the naked violence of that encounter is much more evident. We can all say that what has been happening in Gaza has been humanitarian crimes, and the ICJ has been saying it, and it doesn't matter, right? Because what we learned from that encounter then is that if you are going to talk about a respectful ontological encounter that can be equal, then the internal conditions for sovereignty have to be there. The community has to have...
You're muted.
I'm muted.
Yeah.
No, I'm not.
Are you not?
Maybe my battery died. My battery died.
You gotta switch it the other way. Yeah, there you go.
Is it working now? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
This happens to me in teaching too. So, if there is... Where was I? Yes, the internal conditions for sovereignty have to be there, right? The community has to have the power to negotiate those relationships, and those infrastructures can be built, right? But at the global level, that becomes much more complicated, or impossible, because there is no one to mediate that relationship, right? So whoever has more hard power sets the law, And, you know, and actually, for example, thinking about the relationship of Virginia Tech with the communities with which it engages, what happens when that research is happening across national borders, right? I'm actually often in that place where I have to get IRB in Brazil and in the US. But for example, international contract law, which is called transnational law, is historically invented in the 1800s, not to protect the communities and the places that where these corporations are operating, but to ensure the continuous access, the so-called acquired right of those corporations after formal independence. It's very recent that law has been used to say something about indigenous people's right, about third world sovereignty, and so on. And in the absence of any kind of possibility for mediation at the global level, who's really liable at that point, right? So I think this is one of the things that we've been getting to. It's that what's really radical about that difference is the difference of hard power that we can't escape. So, yeah. I was muted.
All right, thank you all for your presentations. Those were really insightful presentations, connected by several themes. For me, what stood out was indigenous sovereignty, you know, as that plays out in research practices, thinking about healing practices, and of course, the politics of territorial governance. So thank you. Thank you for your questions. See you guys next week here, same time, for another session of our seminar series. Thank you all.
John,
hold on, I think Fernanda has a word for us.
Yeah, if you can pass the word to Edward, because there is an event coming next week. So maybe, Edward, you could talk about the event and invite people. Thank you all.
Yeah, I'm going to be breakdancing next week. No, next Wednesday, just down the road here in Godal, the Indigenous Studies Symposium will be taking place from 8 a.m. to 5:30. There's going to be breakfast, lunch, and dinner supplied for everyone in attendance. 4 panels covering a variety of different things. Sovereignty is actually one of them. So if you're interested, I can share an email with Fernanda. She can maybe send it to your listserv so you can get that info. One of your students will actually be presenting, right? So yeah, so support, come out and hang out. And the plaque. Oh yes, and then we're also dedicating Monacan Indian Nations seal on the 4th floor of Major Williams. So that is on Thursday at 10:30 a.m. If you want to come out and have some light refreshments and see this awesome seal unveiled, please come check that out. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.